like to formally welcome Darius to the Power BI Community Times in South Florida. Darius Liktorius is a cloud solutions architect with over 20 years of experience in solutions architecture, performance optimization, database administration, optimization, infrastructure engineering, software development and solutions, cloud solutions, both Azure and AWS, anything IT. He's extraordinary professional, let me tell you. Thank you, Darius. Super excited for your visit today and this presentation about Power BI REST API. And when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. And I changed the resolution, so hopefully it will be good for everyone who is watching. So welcome, everyone. So Cecilia asked me to conduct a session on a less discussed topic, which is the Power BI REST API. We'll talk about what that is and also what the word REST is. Let's go ahead and just take a quick, just a friendly reminder as a courtesy. If you're not asking a question, if you don't mind muting your teams, that would be awesome. I would normally ask you to mute a cell phone, but a little bit different here than in person, right? So this is my contact and follow me information, my Twitter, my blog, my LinkedIn, and there is a address here to the presentation landing page and resources. You're going to need to forgive me. I have not managed to put that page up today. Work got the best of me. My 9 to 5 got the best of me and limited my ability to get that done. I wanted to get that done. So I will be doing that immediately after this presentation and look to have that no later than tomorrow morning when you go ahead and hit that URL right there at the top. So take note of that. I will have this page back up at the end, and Cecilia can also distribute that, that URL for you later, okay? So just some introductions. I know Cecilia introduced me, so I'll not much specific that I would want to add to that, except my focus has been cloud and cloud-related architectures, both on Amazon and Microsoft Azure. I'm certified on both. And as far as my Power BI experience, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not a BI analyst. I'm not a BI data modeler. I'm also not someone who can make a Power BI report look pretty. What I am, though, is someone who's spent the last year and a half for a Big Four accounting services firm creating and leading a visualizations platform that was based on Power BI. And interestingly enough, we had a lot of work to do with the REST API when it came to that solution. So if you can imagine, it was basically the need to have different application teams that wanted to surface visualizations and reports inside of a web interface. We needed a way to programmatically publish those reports through, if you will, like a CI/CD process, gathered up from multiple Git repositories, and trying to get those reports and data sets published into Power BI and all of the management that came with that. So a lot of back-end work and architecture that went in there. I wasn't responsible for, the visualizations. Of course, we had other individuals for that, but that kind of spurred, the thought of this particular topic for you, and something that's not really touched on that much in the community. So here we go. About you. So it's hard to conduct kind of a survey. You're welcome to do a raise hand if you'd like. Inside of the Teams app, if you'd like. If you're new to Power BI, maybe we could take account of that, or someone can put some notes in the chat. But if you're experienced with Power BI as well, would be good to know, or if you've ever used the Power BI REST API. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try my best to address all three audiences throughout this presentation. I'll do my best to make sure no one's left behind. But please do interject through a chat, and Cecilia, if you can draw my attention to it, because I can only focus on so many things here at one time. So if we do have questions, we will stop for questions after each demo. And if there's something specific that you're falling behind or you're lost, please feel free to interrupt, and we'll see if we can clarify some points for you. So we're going to do an overview of the Power BI REST API and what it is. And and how it, what its purposes are, and just get a general overview of that. We'll go deeper into the structure of the API and the various methods that are available to us and what we can do with them. And then we'll go ahead and mix some demos in throughout the presentation. And like I said, we'll do some Q&A. All right, so first off, what is the Power BI REST API? Specifically, you might be wondering, what's this word REST, right? Well, we've probably rested at home quite a bit over the last year and a half, but that's not what that is. So REST is a concept of a basically API interface, application programming interface, that transfers back and forth the current represented state of a particular object or set of objects into one particular response. So it's basically a sessionless, API interface where you go ahead and actually just provide credentials if there are, authentication requirements, and you can, based on the URL of the interface that you're communicating to, which happens to be over an HTTP or an HTTPS, preferably secured endpoint, when you go ahead and access that API through a URL path, you can do so, and that URL path, as you'll see, indicates what part of the API you're looking for or what method on the API you're accessing. And as timing would have it, apparently there's some birds outside my window now, so that's excellent timing. I apologize for the menagerie and the background noises. But so just like with HTTP, when you access a web page and you go ahead and browse to a web page, that HTTP action method is known as a HTTP GET call when we're getting information. When you fill out a form and you go ahead and submit that form, that's known as a POST. It's an HTTP POST. There are other verbs or methods, actions inside of HTTP in the language, such as put and delete and option and all kinds of others that are useful for different ways to communicate over HTTP for various things. Like OneDrive, for example, communicates over HTTPS. So when you're integrating and you're accessing documents inside of Excel or Word, etc., you're accessing them over HTTPS through OneDrive, and these verbs are going back and forth. So we want to get information or we want to post information. Post is typically we're adding something. You can also put something. So that often is the updating of something that already exists. And of course, you can do other things like delete information. So based on the verb that you're going ahead and sending with your HTTP request, you can actually indicate to the, in this case, REST API, what it is that you want to do with that object. All right, so do you want to get a list of workspaces inside of Power BI? Do we want to create a workspace? Do we want to create a report, etc.? And the actual payload of information that's coming across the line across the wire over HTTP, in the case of REST by default and most commonly, is JSON. JSON is a JavaScript object notation, which if you've ever seen a file, a configuration file with some squiggly brackets, some curly brackets, and you'll see that. I'll show it to you and what that looks like. But most commonly you've seen that inside of web development or other similar interactions with the web. REST is really lightweight and it's quite reliable. It's lighter weight than a SOAP API interface, which is basically using XML and some additional headers, and those are, let's call them heavier weight, versus them being lightweight in terms of API calls. So specifically, the Power BI REST API, as I mentioned, provides us with access to do certain things within Power BI, affect different parts of the Power BI interface, right? The actual service and what rather is up there and hosted for us. So what it's not, though, I want to be clear about is the Power BI has a couple different APIs. There's a REST API, which is your main access point as a user or as an administrator to access the Power BI service. But there's a completely different set of an API, which is also known as the JavaScript API, and that's used for embedding an actual visual or report or dashboard inside of a web page or a web interface for a user to go ahead and be able to access and pull in that Power BI content into a page. Now, I'll go ahead and spend some time on it. Towards the end, if we have time, I'll go ahead and actually come back to this playground.powerbi.com if you're interested. That playground is specifically for the JavaScript API. It's for basically setting up and testing how you might want to embed Power BI visuals into a web interface. So we're not going to dive deep into that. That could be a different session altogether. So let's move on. So there's different ways to access the Power BI REST API so that there's levels of abstraction. You don't have to know how to form an entire JSON object, to go ahead and actually make requests to the API. We've got abstractions for that. You can do that through Power BI PowerShell modules that are available to us from Microsoft. So those are basically modules that have a set of what are known as PowerShell commandlets, which allow us to go ahead. And by the way, the PowerShell king is on the line, which is David Cobb. Good to have you here, by the way. So PowerShell modules that have commandlets and allow us to go ahead and make calls to the Power BI API, right? And so we don't have to get really verbose with it. There's also a Power BI.NET SDK, so you can call from C# or any other .NET language. You can call the Power BI API using that SDK. But you can go lower level. And like I said, go ahead and use REST API endpoints directly if you know how to code against them using HTTP request and response type of objects inside of your specific programming interface, and basically access the REST API at a really low level and get some additional information out of it. There's also, curiously, even though while PowerShell wraps some of these API calls for us, and makes them nice and easy and elegant, there is a little bit of a lower level call that you can make within PowerShell using the PowerShell modules, which is this invoke Power BI REST method, which we'll go ahead and touch on in the demos. And what that allows you to do is basically get into the nitty gritty, get more information, because the downside to our PowerShell modules that you're going to see from Microsoft is that they're not up to date. They're not current with the Power BI service. They're about 3 to 4 to 6 months behind from what I can tell in my experience and what I've seen. So they're missing properties, they're missing attributes, they're missing certain methods, etc. And so you're going to miss out. The documentation says I should have the last access date for this report. Why don't I see the last access date when I'm working with it through the PowerShell modules? Well, it's because that's maybe not a good example, but it's an example of a property that might be missing, right? That the documentation talks about, that the PowerShell module is just not exposing. So we'll touch on more lower level accesses. Okay. So I have a few demos that I've created in PowerShell. I also went ahead and started a pretty substantial yesterday demo that I was going to try to lift and cram in before we had this session, and I got it 90% there on a .NET based demo that was pretty extensive. I was going to have you all go to a Azure App Service, hit a web page, and basically log your IP address location information and populate a Power BI data set and have that, put up a really nice visual for everyone of where everyone's located for this session. It would have been awesome to do. Unfortunately, I ran into some issues there at the very end, and I had to scrap it for now, but I will try to finish that up tonight, get past the issue that I was having, and post that as part of the sample code, even though we didn't get a chance to address it here. We'll go ahead and go through it. And frankly, I'll go ahead and actually record a session on my own, and I'll go ahead and still circulate it through Cecilia so that everyone can still benefit from it, because it was so close, so cool. And unfortunately, the demo gods, as they say, weren't on my side. So, all All right, so let's go ahead and let's take a look real quick at the actual Power BI API here. Let's start out. Let me pull ahead and just go ahead and first take a look at the REST API documentation here. I'll pull that up and bring it to the screen for you. You know, when you can see this, it looks like you guys can see this by now. So this is, and the links are going to be in the resources for you. So don't feel like you have to, but you're welcome, of course, to take screenshots now. This is the landing page for the documentation on the Power BI REST APIs. I'm going to be clear about this, that they're sometimes vague, and you have to probably, for lack of a better word, play around with the API calls to get a sense of what is really available to you in terms of properties, whether it aligns with the documentation, or you might find some extra ones or some that are missing. But it's, as you can see, the date of this particular page was 2019 at the top of the screen. So that's the last time this page was updated. So unfortunately, some of the information is not quite current. But there's different parts to the actual API. All right, and we'll dig into all of these separately after the first couple of demos. We'll really get into what they really are. But as you can see, there's different parts of Power BI service that you can manipulate. Data sets, reports. You might be looking at this list going, where are workspaces? And that was the first thing I did when I first started messing with the API almost 2 years ago. I was like, where's the workspaces? Like, I just want to see a list of workspaces. Confusing as it is, this section of the API here, groups, is what was originally referred to as a workspace inside of the native API for Power BI. So the API refers to workspaces as groups. If it gets even more confusing when you go to actually retrieve the information or work with it, you actually pass a workspace ID, not a group, but a workspace ID in some cases. So it can, keep in mind that a group in the API is synonymous with workspace, and not to be confused with users, which is a separate section altogether. Okay, so we'll go into all of these different categories in a little bit more detail as we go through the demos and as we come back to circle back through everything here. So just keep in mind that there's different categories here to the API and so forth. Another link I want to go ahead and pull up here is the PowerShell commandlets that we talked about. So this is where we're going to start. We're going to start with the PowerShell commandlets to basically interface with the API without having to worry about all of the details. Okay, you'll see this documentation is from 2018, but the commandlets themselves are actually, I'll just go ahead and link straight to the PowerShell gallery. The commandlets themselves are, more current. This particular one, for example, let's see when it was actually posted. Thought they would actually give me the date of the most recent one, which is a really unfortunate thing. Oh, here we are, 3/24. Okay, 3/24/21. Here, so 2 months ago, this was updated, the actual commandlet. So you say, okay, well, like I told you, it can sometimes be several months behind, right? This happens to be pretty current. There was a time when it was almost 6 months old, and that was last year. So they do try to keep it updated, but it's not always consistent. So let's back up to the documentation page here. I just wanted to touch on the fact that there are different sections of the PowerShell specific commandlets that you can install and import into your PowerShell code. So PowerShell has become pretty much the de facto scripting language for all things Azure, and ironically quite heavily used for AWS as well, for Amazon AWS. PowerShell is super powerful. The syntax is somewhat similar to C# or some hints of what you might look at and say that kind of looks like JavaScript, but it's not. PowerShell is used for administering, a lot of different services and systems, not only in the clouds, but even in a Windows Server OS and now even inside of a Linux OS. So PowerShell's come a really long way, and it's actually a super, great environment. I encourage you to get familiar with it. The more you use it, the more you'll become comfortable with it, and the world opens up to you, not only on your own computer per se, but in the cloud services, including Power BI specifically. So it's something definitely to look into and get comfortable with. So these are different modules, set of modules that contain Power BI commands known as commandlets inside of these different modules. And so different sections of the API can be accessed through these different modules. Well, you can grab all of these modules by using this roll-up module here at the top called Microsoft Power BI Management. So we can install all of the ones below by installing the roll-up module and not have to worry about installing what we might be missing if we go ahead and now all of a sudden need to use a different part of the API. The only reason that these are split up is so that if you needed to have a really lightweight redistributable package of software that you want to go ahead and use the PowerShell commandlets here for that purpose, then you might go ahead and just install the modules that you need. But I just encourage you to install the rollup module for 99% of all situations. So you can run this in anything as far back as PowerShell 3.0, which basically takes us back to Windows 7, I believe, if I'm not wrong, or even Windows Vista. I could be wrong on that when version 3 was out. But there's also something known as PowerShell Core, which can run on multiple platforms. So it runs basically on Windows or Linux, etc. And so when it comes to actually installing these particular modules that we just looked at, you need to actually install them within PowerShell by issuing a command called install module. And you'll see my code doing that. But install module is a prerequisite. And once you've installed the module, you will want to go ahead and import the module so you can make use of that actual code. So let's go ahead and actually dig into a demo. Let me move this to the other screen real quick. All right, so this is a script that I wrote that basically is got a few things going on. Instead of going line by line by line and installing and running every single command, which I'm not as skilled as David Cobb to do. I don't have a visual memory like him, at least to that awesome degree. But what I did do is I went ahead and put together a script here that allows you to pass in a username and a password. And if you go ahead and pass those in, those are credentials that you're going to connect to the Power BI REST API with. If you don't go ahead and actually pass in a username and password, it will prompt you to log in. That's something that's automatically built into the PowerShell REST API commandlets for Power BI and for Azure. And so you'll see that happen here because I'm not going to call it with values to the username and password. You saw the command in the documentation to install the Power BI management module. So you'll see that command is here in my script. In order to not have warnings coming across the user interface and to not waste time in the script, this basically takes a step to first look to see if the module is installed, and if it's not, it goes ahead and installs that PowerShell module. All right, so that's a first preliminary check. We're going to install the module if we don't have it. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to import the actual pieces, the modules that we remember that the Power BI management is a roll-up module, okay, and it has all those other modules in it. It's a parent to the rest of them. And so here I'm selecting these two additional modules that I need because those are parts of the actual set of modules that I need to access and make use of. So again, we basically go ahead and need to authenticate against the Power BI service, all right? That can come in a very simple statement, which is in the login Power BI statement. And you could literally just issue this one statement that I've highlighted. It will prompt you for credentials and it'll get you logged in. The reason that this script has some additional hoops to it is just to be able to not force you to be prompted every single time you run this script if you're making changes to the script, or if you're going ahead and wanting to run it multiple times. For example, you don't want to keep getting prompted for a username and password, right? So basically what PowerShell does is when you're running within the context of the same PowerShell session, you can, certain variables that you define can actually exist in memory when you run it again. And so what I've done here is I've basically gone ahead and I've set a variable named Power BI profile, which is what you get back when you go ahead and log into Power BI. All right. And so by setting this variable, I can on a subsequent run check to see if that variable's been set and it's actually equal to something. And if it is equal to something, I basically just bypass this effort. I don't go ahead and I log back. I don't have to log back in because I'm already in my PowerShell session in memory. I already have the credentials cached. If I don't have a cached profile, then we're going to go ahead and actually either authenticate with specific usernames and username and password that was passed in, or prompt for the credentials, which is what's again going to happen when we go ahead and run this. Okay. So after we've gotten that authentication out of the way, which you'll see on every single one of my demo scripts on the left-hand side when we go through them, this part will just keep repeating. In fact, all of this just repeats on those scripts just to keep it simple for the purposes of this demo. And so the main part that we're concerned with here in our very first demo here is we're going to go ahead and get a list of all Power BI workspaces. And we're going to loop through that list. And each workspace, we're going to put out the name of the workspace and the ID of that workspace. All right. And then it's going to go ahead and exit. So again, the first time that we run this, we're not going to have a credential, and it's actually going, well, I just lied. So let me go ahead and restart actually code here real quick. It had my cached credentials from earlier, and I want to go ahead and have you experience the entire process. So let's go ahead and restart this. And it will no longer have my cached credentials, and we can go ahead and actually force it to prompt us for those credentials. So just give it a second to load, and it goes ahead and starts, and it will also go ahead and start PowerShell underneath here. So as soon as that is done, we can go ahead and run. Make sure that yeah, it's still going. Hold on. It has not finished. Any questions while we're, I'll go ahead and take a question while I wait.
I don't see any questions in the chat. If anyone wants to raise a hand and unmute or drop the question in the chat, I can read it.
Darius, somebody mentioned using the invoke the REST method. So
yes.
if you didn't get the coverage you wanted, you could use the invoke REST method. Have you had to do that?
Yeah, that's what I was there. So there's two invoke methods that we'll cover. There's an invoke REST method, which is the lowest level of all REST method invokes inside of PowerShell, right? There's also an invoke Power BI REST method, which you'll go ahead and see in one of my demos. And so I just wanted to clarify that, yeah, there's actually multiple ways to access the API. Thanks for touching on that. So this is just taking a few seconds to get going. Let's go ahead and see if I can go ahead and actually launch this already.
You got questions about the tool that you're using?
This is Visual Studio Code. I should clarify that. Thank you. So also known as Code from Microsoft. This is a free download, and encourage you to pick it up. It's multi-platform capable. They have a Mac version as well. So I ran the script, and it says, our script says it's prompting us for the Power BI credentials, right? So go ahead and pick an account. Since I'm already connected and authenticated with my account, I can just click on it. If I wanted to use a different account, of course, I can specify that here as well. So this is your traditional Microsoft Azure credential, pop-up. I'll go ahead and pick my credentials. Since I'm already authenticated on my machine and connected through Windows, it shouldn't prompt me for a password. It should just go straight through, because I happen to have already been authenticated with Microsoft Office and other apps. And there we go. We have one workspace. It's called Dev Workspace, and there's the ID. So if we go ahead and we create additional workspaces, we can easily go ahead and actually see those appear in the list as well. All right. So let's dissect the actual call here, the Get Power BI Workspace call. All right. So let's go back to the actual documentation here for the PowerShell commandlets. All right. So Get Power BI Workspace. This is the actual documentation for that commandlet that we're going ahead and running. So there's different things that we can pass into that commandlet. You'll notice that I didn't pass anything into it. So by not passing any parameters by default, it gets us all of the workspaces that I, meaning my user, has access to. So if I don't have access to a given workspace, I won't see it. Unless you're an admin that has access to everything, you're not going to see all of the workspaces. You're just going to see what you've been given access to, okay? And so there's different parameters. They're documented just like most PowerShell commandlet documents do. The pages for documentation describe them. They give you examples. You can go ahead and actually change the scope of your search if you are an admin, for example, to Power BI. You can actually scope your search to the entire organization, and you can even add a filter to your search. So I want to just look for a workspace with the name Contoso Sales. And if it was spelled with different, because it's case sensitive, the filter, if it was spelled with different casing, an capital C or a capital S, I want to go ahead and lowercase that that name of the workspace that's coming back, so that I can know that I got them all. But so you have the ability to go ahead and actually change the scope. You have the ability to show all of the results or just the first result, or you can skip by a number of results in the list. And some of these parameters are common across all these Power BI PowerShell calls. Some of them are not. So the filter is one such example that's not. It's only in certain GET calls, and it uses a OData format and syntax. It's something that you would have to look up and see what's a valid OData filter format. And the example that was given up here is one such example. So you've got those. You can go ahead and actually return a specific workspace by ID. So you can search by name, but you can also search by ID. So when you search by name, you can actually, if you know the name explicitly, you can use the name parameter as well. So what we'll do is let's go ahead and actually really quickly pull up the Power BI service. So I'm in the Power BI portal. I'm in the dev workspace that you just saw. And let's just, for the sake of it, let's go ahead and create an additional workspace. All right, we'll call it Power BI Times. We'll create that workspace. Why didn't it take my name? It didn't like me. I think that was the search field. That was my problem. My mistake, jumping ahead of myself. All right. So Power BI Times, we could give it a description if we want. Let's just go ahead and create this. It's an empty workspace. So now I have two workspaces that I have access to. Now, if we go ahead and rerun our script, two things are going to happen. The first thing is that we will not be prompted for credentials again because of our nice little plumbing that we have up top to reuse credentials that we've previously used for the REST API, as we saw. The second thing we're going to see, obviously, is two different workspaces. So let's go ahead and rerun this. And now we have a Power BI Times workspace. So just a clean, simple example of how we can go ahead and actually retrieve results from a simple call, loop through them, and output some of the properties that you see here. So you might be asking, how do I know what properties are available? Well, when you install the module and you use something nice like Visual Studio Code that supports PowerShell to go ahead and work with PowerShell here inside of the development environment, if you access an object and you push the period, right? You push the dot, hold on a second, push the dot, and we have something called IntelliSense, which is in Visual Studio as well. So it's here in Visual Studio Code, also known as Code. And these are properties that this particular workspace object has. It has an ID. We know it has a name. There's a ability to enumerate the reports that are on that workspace. So we can go ahead and actually loop through the reports that are in that workspace if we like. We can look at some additional properties, such as whether it's on a dedicated capacity, which is a Power BI premium service offering, and you have the ability to put a workspace on a physical dedicated capacity that you pay for, and so forth. So there's different properties here that we can access for a workspace. And reports will have their own properties, and data sets will have their own as well. So
you have two questions, Darius.
Let's go.
Paul is asking if is there a call available to refresh a dataset?
Yes, there is a call to refresh a data set. Unfortunately, you're still bound to the actual limits of refreshes per day based on the service subscription level that you have, whether it's a pro license or a premium license or premium by user license. So you're still limited to how many refreshes per day you can have. So while we can do that programmatically, you could easily get carried away if you schedule it to happen every 5 minutes, and you'll hit your limit of how many refreshes you can do per day based on your license. I do want to touch on a workaround for that refresh limit. There is something new in the last few months for Power BI service called an XMLA endpoint. XMLA is a protocol used for Azure and SQL analysis services. And we can now host a traditional tabular model that you would host inside of SQL Server Analysis Services or Azure Analysis Services inside of the Power BI service. So XMLA endpoints, if you have them enabled and you enable it for a specific workspace, if you make calls through the XMLA protocol using the same type of PowerShell or other code that you would call a analysis services endpoint to do a refresh using something called TMSL, which is the tabular model scripting language, you can actually basically have unlimited data set refreshes. So if you're hosted inside of a workspace that has XMLA endpoint enabled, and you use TMSL through PowerShell or some other language to go ahead and actually make calls to that XMLA endpoint, you can actually refresh that data set with no limitations. So that's just like a workaround I wanted. It's a little more advanced case. I just wanted everyone to be familiar with the fact that there are limits and you can bypass them in certain scenarios. But as far as refreshing the data set specifically, let's go ahead and take a look at these calls. So if you come to the base documentation of the REST APIs, not the PowerShell documentation, but the base REST documentation, we can come here and we can go ahead and we can see all the different calls that we can do. And one of them is you can actually update the refresh schedule of an actual data set. So you can actually change the schedule of what you've set inside of the Power BI service, but you can also go ahead and refresh the data set. So we're jumping a little bit ahead here, but I want to go, we'll just touch on it now anyway. You'll notice that in the REST API documentation, there is 2 definitions for practically every single call in the API. There's refresh data set and there's refresh data set in group. So a really nuanced thing that has caught multiple developers that I've worked with is this difference. And they will by default just say, oh, I just want to refresh the data set. And they may have searched for this through Google or something, right? And they go straight to this page and they're like, wow, this is the call that I need. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use it. And it doesn't work. Why? Because they're trying to access a data set in a workspace that's not my workspace. Everyone familiar with my workspace? So let's go back to that user interface here. We've got a list of workspaces that we can share with other parties, other users. And we have this fancy reserved My Workspace up here at the top. My Workspace is the default private workspace for me, Darius Liktorius, with this Power BI Pro license. So I can place content in there. I can even share some of that content with certain people, but it's not available for digestion or ingestion from the rest of the organization. Okay, so My Workspace is a private workspace, again, just for me. It's not intended for the organization as a whole to use. So when we're going back to these API calls, you need to be cognizant of the fact that when you refresh a data set or you import a report or you you want to look at the contents of a workspace, are we looking at My Workspace or are we looking at some specific workspace out there that is shared by the organization? And that's what all these in-group calls are. The in-group API calls are going to go ahead and, in this case, trigger a refresh from a specified data set from the specified workspace. So you would, and remember, here's that darn group again. They're talking about workspaces as a group. So again, in the API, a workspace is a group. Hopefully that answers the question. These are the actual calls that you can use in the API. The actual PowerShell commandlets, on the other hand, if we look at the data set, the data section of the PowerShell commandlets, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think that there's a refresh call, as you can see here, and I don't think the set Power BI data set has a way to, yeah, it doesn't, to trigger it. So there are no Power BI dataset refresh calls inside of the PowerShell commandlets. So this is a great example of where we would have to call natively, do an invoke on the REST API. I'll show you how to do that. We'll actually go ahead and we'll do a demo with that in a few demos down of how to do, a low-level call like that, and we'll go ahead and actually intentionally refresh a data set. How about that? Another question, David?
There is a question from Nico, but it's related to workspaces. Is there an admin override on other people creating workspaces to see them? Any way to manage workspaces, Paul?
An admin override. So I guess what exactly the question there is in that regard. Like if you're not an admin, can you gain admin access? Is that maybe what's being asked? Do we get a little clarification on that? And what I can do is I can, if they can clarify the question, and I'll come back to that as soon as we're done with some more demo. Because I'm not sure what's being asked.
I see that George already answered that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So going back to our code examples here, we looped through and we were able to see our workspaces, right? And if we come back to our list of demos, let's go ahead and actually pull up the next demo. So the next demo is basically going to take the same path to set up the installation of the module and logging in if it needs to log in. But ultimately what it's going to do is it's going to get a reference to a specific workspace. A workspace that either you passed in by name, if you ran the PowerShell commandlet from a command prompt, you can pass the name of it. But I'm defaulting the name at the very top, to dev workspace. You can see it right here. So the workspace name parameter is going to be the dev workspace that you saw in the previous demo and inside the portal. So we're going to get a reference to one specific workspace. It's not a collection of them. It's just one workspace. And if for some reason we passed in a non-valid workspace name, I want to go ahead and throw an exception here so that the script stops running. Otherwise, we're going to keep going forward. And what we're going to do is we're going to get a list of all the data sets in that workspace, loop through and display all the data sets. And then we're going to go ahead and get a list of all of the reports in that workspace and put those out on the screen as well. So let's go ahead and run this. Now, there's only one report and one data set. They both happen to have the same name. You may have noticed when you publish a report from a PBIX inside of Power BI Desktop into a workspace, and it creates a report and a data set of the exact same name. So by default, whatever you put into these workspaces is going to have the same name. So it might look a little confusing. We have, these objects here with the same name. We could actually go ahead and clarify this a little bit by adding the ID of the data set and the report ID here, and you'll see that they're actually different and prove to you that we're not looking at the same exact thing. There we go. Two different GUIDs, different numbers. One is the data set for the report and the other one's the report itself. And so we can see the two calls that we made. We made a get Power BI dataset call. We passed in the workspace ID from our first call at the very top where we got the Power BI workspace. We're going ahead and passing that into the Power BI dataset call. And then the get Power BI report call for the same parameter, we're going to get a list of reports. So pretty straightforward. We're just getting a little bit more, further in here, digging in. You'll see that I've outputted the properties that were available to us here explicitly, right? There's a couple more properties. There's an embed URL and a web URL. You could output those individually, but if you're in the middle of debugging or coding in PowerShell, one of the nice features is this format list commandlet that you can pipe with the pipe character. You can pipe an object into format list, which is somewhat helpful. So let's go ahead and do this format list call for both the report and the data set. So I'm going to do this. And now what we're going to have is and I'm going to go ahead and actually comment out our write outputs here. Inside of PowerShell, if you don't specify to write output, if a commandlet returns data, it will go automatically to the output stream, which would typically be your console. So the format list commandlet that we're passing the data set into is returning a value. But since there's nothing to return it to, it outputs it to the screen. It's just kind of a nice handy feature of PowerShell. So if you don't capture the result like you do here, when you look at grabbing the data sets from the response, you're actually going to get the output straight to the screen. So let's go ahead and rerun this, and we're actually going to see all of the properties for both of these objects output to the screen. Let me go ahead and expand this screen so we can look at this a little bit better. So getting data sets. This is all of the properties for this particular data set that we returned, right? So above and beyond what we thought we had access to, it's right here and it's in front of us. And same here for the reports. These are all the properties for that particular one report because all we have is one. There's a target storage mode here. ABF, I forget what it stands for off the top of my head, but ABF is basically a traditional data set that holds data inside of itself. You can also see a different target storage mode for data sets that are basically referencing an external data source somewhere. So this is like an internal, data set. But if you had a data set that was basically just referencing like a direct query data set that's referencing an analysis services server, you would actually have a different storage mode here. So to understand what all of these properties really are and what it means, you basically you can infer some of them, right? But you can also go ahead and actually figure it out through the documentation. So let's do that together, because I feel like if you don't know how to dig for this, you may not, you may be a little bit, less efficient and less effective at what you're doing. So in that get Power BI dataset call, we have our inputs here on the right-hand side. I want you to look at the articles here. We can go to the outputs. So what is the output? It says it's a system type object. Well, that wasn't helpful. Like, what is it? We saw all the properties that came through, right? So what is actually coming back? So we really have to come to the base documentation of the API and basically go to the section that we believe we're working in, which is the data sets, and the get data sets in group call that we actually went ahead and made through Power BI behind the scenes. So this is how I figured out the API over a year ago. I had to basically just mess around with it, dig into the documentation, and see what was there. So you can see that typically the data set call to get the data sets returns a type of object known as a data set object. In this case, this is a collection of data sets, but let's go ahead and click on this here. So data sets. Well, there can be one or more data sets inside of that call in the native API that the PowerShell call keeps from us. Like, we don't have to worry about the fact, am I returning 1 or am I returning 100? PowerShell was taking care of that for us, because if there is only one, there's one data set object that comes back. If multiple data sets come back, guess what? It's a enumerable or loopable collection of data sets, which is what we see here is an array of data sets. That's what these two brackets mean, is an array of data sets. So let's dig into data sets. What does a data set have? So all of these properties here is what can come back from the API, and you'll see all these different properties that are present. But let's go back for just a second. That list sure looks short, to me at least. I mean, that's not everything that I see in the documentation. I see created date. I see these other properties that are not present there: upstream data flows, encryption, etc. I don't see that here. And so how can we access that? So the only way to access the additional properties would be to go ahead and make a more low-level call, which we'll do next, and I'll go ahead and show you. But before we do that, I want to come back to our slide presentation, talk about the different parts of the API again, get some clarification on that, and take a few questions, and then we can come back and take a look at making a more low-level call. But as you can see right here, clearly the list of properties is much longer than what we see coming from PowerShell. Maybe not much, but close to an extra 50% of more properties there, right? So is the name exactly the same? Not necessarily. The name of each property is not necessarily always exactly the same inside of PowerShell as it is the API, but most of the time it is, as you can see. So let me just take a question if we have any, and then we can continue on. Do you have any questions?
Let me see. There was a question from Grant. Where was it? Here it is. Maybe your demo is going to get there, but this is accessing your own workspaces programmatically.
This is accessing, what we did in the demo is we accessed the workspaces that I have access to, right, programmatically. And you mean the My Workspaces section, like my personal workspaces? Is that, if that's your question, with PowerShell, you can access them as well. I was specifically and explicitly just accessing, the list of workspaces that are available inside of, the group of workspaces for the organization. I don't know if that helps. There's a scope call. So if we go back to workspaces inside of PowerShell, get Power BI workspace, there's a scope, and the scope itself as a parameter. Hold on a second. Scope. It says that individual is the default versus an organization. I think that the question is why aren't we seeing the My Workspace?
No. The question is more related, I think, because it continues. Grant says, I guess I was under the impression that we could use the REST API to get external data into Power BI as a data source. In example, GPS data from a third party that has given us REST access to our own equipment.
Okay, that's a fair question. So actually, the REST API has the ability to add rows into a data set. And that was part of the demo that I was trying to finish to put together for this presentation. And it was a more advanced topic than an intro to REST API, but I was still going to present on it towards the end of the presentation if anyone was interested. Like I said, I'd be more than happy to go ahead and make a recording, and I will once I have it all up and working. I just had an authentication issue when I deployed it to Azure. And so once I get that up and running, you'll basically go ahead and see what happens is that you can take a data set that holds data inside of it, right? So let's go to the API here real quick, and you can actually, hold on, where is it? The actual API call, just a minute. Update, I think it's, oh, it was there. Let me just make sure it's not under imports, just a minute. Nope. In .NET, it wraps the API as well. I want to say that it was part of the, I saw this just when I was writing it yesterday. Where is it? I cannot believe I'm not seeing it. There is an API call that allows you to directly update rows inside of a data set. Maybe it's in the different section here. Hold on. I think it's push data sets. Yes, there it is. Push data sets. So you can actually post rows into the table. You can even create tables. You can modify your schema. You can do some pretty interesting things with the data set. This would be an example of what you would be doing is basically your ability to actually put data directly into a data set that you have inside of Power BI. So you could connect to a third party, grab the data, and based on the schema that you've put into your data set, you could add rows to the data set programmatically. That's one way. The other way is something known as Power BI apps, which there are the ability for you from a marketplace of apps to connect to things like Salesforce and such, right? So there's those as well. But if it's a specific custom third party that's not part of the Power BI app list in the marketplace for Microsoft, then you're basically left to what I just described, which is adding rows to your own data set. That's one way to do it. Another way would be to have a data set referencing a database that you add rows to programmatically. So directly into Power BI, or into a data source. Hope that helps. So let's come back to our presentation. Any more questions? I want to make sure I don't miss someone that might have one right now. Just real quick.
I don't see anything yet.
Okay. Cool. So the API structure and methods, we've looked at these already. I just wanted to have a visual here for everyone so that it's clear, and we'll go through each one here. There's an administrative API that will take care of things like tenant settings and those types of tasks that are typically available to an administrator, and you do have to have admin Power BI administrator rights inside of your tenant to make those calls. So that's the
thing about him is he's been watching us. And
do you have a question? Someone had a question?
I think it was a microphone. Let me see.
So so you have to have admin rights to call into the admin section of the API. But you also may need admin rights to make certain calls, like when we were listing out a list of workspaces, you may recall there was a filter to look for workspaces using a filter. And there's also, let me just jump back really quick, that there is a scope for the call to get a list of workspaces. So if you scope yourself to the organization level, it returns all workspaces within the tenant, but you have to be an administrator to initiate that call. So it will fail if you're not a Power BI admin when you make the call, just so you're aware. So there's that difference in individual versus organization scope. So admin has its own section, and some of our calls have properties that allow us to do organization-wide, make organization-wide changes which require admin rights. Dashboards accesses the dashboards that we might have inside of our tenant. The data sets, of course, for data sets. Workspaces are known as groups inside of the API structure. Imports are the ability to add content into Power BI workspaces. So importing a PBIX to create a report with a data set inside of Power BI, and we'll see that together. We'll go ahead and do a demo on that. Reports allows us to access, change, delete, refresh, reports. So that's there as well. And then there's, the secondary areas that a select subset of individuals would probably need or be using. Apps, like the integration with Salesforce and other types of apps, you can do those things programmatically. Capacities is to administer your Power BI premium capacities that you've purchased from Microsoft to run your workspaces on dedicated hardware that you've actually procured from Microsoft. So that's only for premium users that have also purchased premium capacity. And then data flows is, you may or may not be familiar with data flows, is a way to access and ingest data into Power BI and also into other services inside of Azure. The embed token is specifically to embed. So I told you that I didn't mislead you. That I said that the embedding is not covered as part of the REST API. It's not. That's a JavaScript API. But you can use the REST API, and you do use the REST API to obtain something known as an embed token. An embed token is what you use to pass to your JavaScript API to embed a user interface of Power BI for a website. So again, totally separate topic. We could talk about it for an hour or more. We'll touch on it a little bit later before we're done here. But gateways is a concept to be able to, a Power BI gateway allows you to access data on premise or inside of a virtual machine like that's running SQL Server that you don't otherwise have access to from the Power BI service. Like let's say your data source is not an Azure SQL database, right? Or some other Azure data source or accessible data source. If you have it on SQL Server, whether it's on premise or whether it's in a virtual machine inside of Azure or AWS, etc., you can download and install a gateway onto a virtual machine or a computer, and it will be the proxy, if you will. It's literally a gateway between the Power BI service and your SQL Server or Oracle database, for example. So it's a way to get to your private on-prem data, and the gateway section of the API allows you to set up the configuration or modify the configuration of your gateways. Pipelines is something new. It's the ability with a premium license to go ahead and make deployments of your Power BI reports from a development environment easier to deploy into production. So you can have a separate development versus production environment, and you can use pipelines for that purpose. That's brand new technology that just came out a month or two ago, and you have to have a premium license. So that's one of the areas of the API.
There is one question from Nico. Any way to export paginated report content to PDF with API?
Export paginated report. Yes, I believe you can. Let's come in here.
The question is specifically to PDF format.
Don't think PDF. You can export to CSV, I believe. Not the data flow. Hold on. It's not the data flow. Where's the export call? I don't think it's in. It might not be in Power BI. I mean, sorry, not in. It's not in this REST API. I'm sorry, it's not in the PowerShell commandlets. Forgive me. It's in the actual. Let's go here and just make sure that I don't miss it. It might be in the push data sets. I haven't done it, but I've seen the documentation for it. Pretty sure. Maybe not. I thought it was. I thought there was. and I'll go back to it and look. We got tables. There may not be. I thought I could have sworn I saw it. Here, hold on. Reports, export to file. I think this is just. Let me look. Yeah, there you go. Ooh, PDF. Look at that.
Super nice.
Ooh. Look what we're learning.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not going to do it through PowerShell. You're going to have to do it through low-level calls. But yeah, there is export to file in, again, the difference between export to file and export to file in group is, are we exporting from my workspace, quote unquote, or are we exporting from one of the organization's workspaces that are out there used by the organization? Say an explicitly created workspace. So yeah, looks like we can do that, and we should try that. If we have time at the end, we should actually try to make that work. Anyone who wants to hang around, I'd be more than happy to try.
You have another question from Kiati.
Yes.
Is there a way to get a list of reports using a given data source on a gateway?
A list of reports on a given gateway?
Using a given data source on a gateway.
Yeah, I think so. So you can get data sources in a particular workspace. So keep in mind that some of these calls that are like specific to a workspace, because that's just how it's structured. And really, we should probably take a moment here before we dig into any more demos, and let's just talk about this. So we've looked at how we can call PowerShell commandlets and such. We're about to do a demo on how to dig deeper into this, but you'll see that this is the REST call. This is the URL for the REST API call. So it's a GET, it's an HTTP GET at this URL, which will always start with API powerbi.com/v1.0/myorg. Myorg is a placeholder to say for our organization, for our tenant of Power BI. So everything at yourdomain.com is underneath this. And you can see the structure. Groups, again, is workspaces. The group ID is the workspace ID, and it has to be the GUID, not the name. The reports under that workspace, a specific report that we want to look at, and then the data sources for that report. So that you could loop through all the workspaces and then loop through all the reports in each workspace, which I've done before, and then pull up the data sources for every single report, right? When you do that, you can go ahead and actually, in the response here, you'll see that the response is a data sources response, which has a list of data source objects. And if we look at the data source objects, we'll see all of the information for that, including a gateway ID, right? So I could loop through everything. Yes, it's on me to do that. It's more effort, but I have the ability to, in a roundabout way, get to all of my data sources that are on a specific gateway. Maybe I pass in the gateway ID and say, I want, all of the reports that have a data source for this gateway ID, and have it loop through and create a list and add them to an array or a collection or print them out on the screen or whatever you want to do. So you could do it that way. I think there's a gateways section that allows us to get to it a little bit easier. And this will be a lot easier, but I showed you the hard way first, so this should be even more exciting. So here, the API, we're going to go to /gateways, the gateway ID, and get a list of data sources, right? So this would be, of course, a more straightforward way to go ahead and get that. So we have a list of gateway data source objects. We have, basically an entire list of them. So now you have your entire list of IDs of data sources. You even have a data source name, etc. I don't have any gateways set up in my tenant, so I can't show this working. But there you go. That's one way to do it. Two ways to do it. So, going back to the API, let's go ahead and actually look at this a little bit further. So let me pull up the see in my demo what it is that I'm actually looping through real quick. Just hold on a second. I'm going to data sets. Yep. So I'm getting the data sets for a workspace. So let's just go ahead and just look at the data sets call, get data sets in group. I just want to show you guys this sample request, sample response. So if you call the API natively through either PowerShell or C# or name your language, if you want to call it natively, again, you're passing in a specific path inside of the URL to get through the objects that you're trying to get the state for. And then you get your JSON response. And this is what your standard JSON response looks like. It's a standard JavaScript object notation. And so this gives you an example of what the low level operations would look like, right? And I'll show you an example of how we can actually interact with that. Everywhere throughout this documentation, I just wanted everyone to know that there's a really nice try it button right here, and don't be shy. Go ahead and click that. Let's do that real quick. It will ask me to sign in with credentials. I'm already signed in with 2 of them. I'm going to pick the one that I'm primarily using. And I could go ahead and basically, in this case, it requires that I go ahead and provide a workspace ID because this particular parameter is required, right? The group ID parameter is required. So let's go ahead and actually pass it the workspace ID. So I'm going to go to the dev workspace, and just a nice little hint here. When you're accessing the portal, you will see something that looks similar, a path structure that looks similar to what we were seeing inside the API. They even refer to workspaces as groups in the portal. And you'll see that here's the GUID for this dev workspace at the top. So I'm going to grab this GUID, put it into my clipboard. Sorry, come back here. And we're going to paste it into this group ID field that it's asking me to use. These are additional fields I could add here that I could pass, but I'm not going to pass them. I'm just using this particular parameter that's required. So this is the call that it's going to make. Let me try to make this a little bit bigger. It's going to make a call to this URL with my group ID with a /datasets at the end to get a list of data sets, and it's going to pass in this bearer token, which is a really long encoded string of authentication credentials that it grabbed when it asked me what's my user that I want to use. And it grabbed, this is basically a JOT, which is a JavaScript web token for basically HTTP web authorization. It's also used in OAuth, which is Open Authentication Protocol, and it's something known as a bearer token. So that's what you're seeing here, and this is actually an HTTP header that's being set when it's making the call for authentication. You can't just make the call because you have to authenticate. So this is all done behind the scenes for us with PowerShell or .NET, etc. This is now starting to get deeper into how it works, right? So let's go ahead and run this. And we'll see that we got an HTTP 200, which means OK or success. These are some headers that came back to tell us, hey, the content that I just sent you is a JSON formatted content. It's not HTML, it's not XML, it's JSON. So if you were, programmatically interacting with this, this tells the client application or browser what type of content is coming back. And so here we see that we have the JavaScript JSON object notation, and we have all of the details for this particular data set, the customer profitability sample, right? So this is looking similar to the output that we had here when we last ran this call, right? So customer profitability sample for this particular data set, look at that. We have a list of similar looking properties, and that's because they are the same. So you might ask, well, how do you go ahead and actually reproduce this type of low-level call inside of PowerShell, right? So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So we'll go here to the next example. Close out my other example here. So everything else is the same, coming down. We're building on this now. We get the same thing as before. We get the workspace reference for the dev workspace because I'm passing in the dev workspace at the beginning of the script. And what we want to call is we want to call the same API Power BI /groups/group ID /datasets call that we just saw inside of the browser, right, in the Microsoft documentation. So once we've authenticated, which we do higher up in the script, we can invoke the Power BI REST method. And so this particular call asks us for the URL that comes after /myorg. So everything after myorg is what you're specifying when you use the invoke Power BI REST method. This is not to be confused with invoke REST method. Okay, this is a different PowerShell call that you can make inside of PowerShell that has no knowledge of Power BI. It has no knowledge of how to authenticate with Power BI. And if you want to do it that way, you are going to be in for quite a bit more work to get your authentication, to get your bearer token that we saw inside of the actual documentation. Remember this bearer token up here, this whole authorization header? This has to happen. And if you're going to go ahead and you're going to use invoke REST method, you better know how to get that bearer token, frame it up, put it in as a header inside of REST method. It's not complicated, okay? It's just extra step. But you have to have that there to make this call. So to me, that was beyond an intro to the API. So we're going to go ahead and try to stick here with the invoke Power BI REST method, which does the authentication for us based on our connection to Power BI here with login Power BI. And it's using that behind the scenes. We've already established that session. So what we're doing is we're making a get call, which again is in the documentation, right? It's a get, and this is our URL. We're passing in the workspace ID into the URL. And then what we're going to get back is we're actually going to get back JSON. So let's first take a look and see what that actually looks like. Let me just comment out the rest of this code for just a minute. Here we go. I'm going to comment all that out. So what are we going to do? We're going to call that command, or that method at the URL. We're going to put out the response. The response is no longer going to be a list of data sets. It's going to be JSON. It's going to be raw information. Let's go ahead and run this and see what it looks like. Oh, it ran and didn't tell me that it needed to be scrolled. I was wondering what was taking so long. So here's our actual output. We only have one data set in that workspace, but I want you to see that it looks exactly, though it's ugly, it's the same content that we received inside of the browser interface when we ran it here, right? All of this JSON information is actually still present here. It's just smashed together. And so the actual response is JSON that we have to now convert back into something that PowerShell can use. Because to PowerShell, this is just text. So if you want to actually use this in your code, we have to convert it from JSON back into an object to go ahead and actually look through all this information. And before we do that, I wanted to point out to you that you'll see that it's actually the data that we're after is inside of a property in the JSON called value. So we can't just take what we're getting back now, right? This is getting lower level, deeper calls. We have to take what we're getting and we're having to convert it, and we're having to seek out the value within the response. So we're going to do that now. And it's not as complicated as it may sound. So just a minute. comment out what's below there. So we will comment out the response that we just saw, the JavaScript, I'm sorry, the JSON. And you'll see that we have a convert from JSON method, which is part of PowerShell. It allows us to take any string that is in a JSON valid format, which the API gave us, and convert it into an object. I'm calling that object OBJ. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go into the value property, which you also see down here at the bottom, the value property inside of that entire JSON object that comes back. And we're going to go through that value, which happens to have one or more data sets. And how do we know that it has one or more data sets? In JSON, a square bracket open and a square bracket close is, sorry, down here, is an indicator of an array that can be one or more objects. It's not just one object underneath value, it's one or more. And so we right now only have one object. So we're only going to have one data set to look through, right? So we're going to enter the loop. It's going to take the data set that is present inside of each instance in that value array, and we're going to go ahead and just run that format list call to output it. So here we go. There we go. So now we've taken the JSON object response, the JSON string, converted it into an object, and we're using that format list function to format our output here through all the properties that are present. I want you to look at something though. Doesn't this look like a little bit longer than what we had before? Like if I go all the way back up to where we ran before, right? This is our data set before in the previous example. We had an ID, we had, let's see, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 15 properties. Is this longer? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, it's the same. I lied. It looked longer. It looked nice. In some methods, though, this is a way that I want you to be aware that, like I said in the documentation, the PowerShell commandlets can sometimes be behind. And some of the properties that are present in the API that you can get using calls like this, the low-level calls, you can only get to doing this. You will not get to them with the PowerShell commandlets. And I can't think of a good example right now off the top of my head, but I just want you to be aware of that. Any questions so far?
No questions in the chat. Anyone wants to go on mute? I guess no.
Okay, no problem. So
Yeah, Darius.
Yeah, go ahead.
Darius, there's Wilson.
Hey, how are you?
Let me ask, how's it going, man?
Good.
Can you get some of these results back on JSON and pipe them back into some kind of a text file or save the JSON file somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's say for IOIT, and you're not going to take a whole stream, but you take a snapshot of, let's say, from minute 1 to minute 5 or whatever, right? And then you're going to get several JSON things back. Can you just pipe them out to some kind of flat file somewhere?
If you want, sure.
Or storage?
You can export them to CSV if you'd like.
Okay, all right.
But
you don't really have to interpret them. You don't want to interpret them. You just want to collect the data and maybe a sample. Let's say you're collecting a sample of data from somewhere and write it out to somewhere.
Yeah, so what you're referring to is grabbing data from, because keep in mind this is in Power BI, right? So right now we're just looking at metadata of these objects. We're not looking at the actual data in the data set. But is your use case to look at data in the data set specifically?
Yeah, like an audit. I think it's really like a log, and I just want to take a sample of certain transactions out and write them out somewhere.
So you can export the results of a report, but you can't export the actual raw data set information that's inside of the data set. You can only take a report itself and in its rendered state and export that content. Well, you can export the raw data to CSV, I guess, which we saw earlier. So let's work through that as a demo when I'm done with my final demo. I actually, because the other individual asked, can you export to PDF? And so we should be able to easily do a test of exporting to PDF and exporting to a different format.
Okay, CSV is fine, like an ASCII file, that's fine.
Yeah, I understand. So that's the querying, and we've looked at demos that allow us to loop through information. But let's get a little more creative here. You're probably used to publishing a PBIX from Power BI Desktop, or coming into a workspace, and saying, I want to upload a PBIX, right? I want to upload a file through the user interface. What if you want to upload a report on a scheduled basis into Power BI, right? You want to update it in some nightly process or something like that, and you don't want to have to be there to do it. Maybe you have a file path somewhere that you take. If you have, source control, maybe you copy it out of source control, the latest, and you want to deploy it. Until recently, there was no pipeline process or continuous integration / continuous deployment, which is CI/CD. There was no DevOps process for Power BI. You had to write it yourself. And even now that there is such a process, it's limited, and it is only available to premium users, which multiple organizations do not have premium. So what can you do to programmatically upload your reports from, say, development to production, right? So I just wanted to show a quick demo of basically uploading and importing a report. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So actually, let me come back here to the dev workspace. You can see that we have the customer profitability sample, which is comprised of a data set of reports, an Excel workbook that came as a sample with the Power BI service, and they have a dashboard. So that's all that I have right now in this dev workspace. We're going to go ahead and we're going to import another report, which I was hoping to use for the other demo. So in this particular case, I have a report that you can see here on the left-hand side underneath my project called realtimedemo.pbix. And that is something that I'm passing in as a default value for now into the script, so I can just run it at the click of a button. We're going to pull that PBIX. We're going to name the report real-time demo, and we're going to put it into the dev workspace. So same authentication as before. We'll pass all of that similarity. We want to get a reference to the Power BI workspace, and then we want to go ahead and import that report. So we're going to import from the path of the PBIX that I'm passing in, give it the report name into a specific workspace ID, and we want to create or overwrite any existing reports. All right. So let's go ahead and actually run this. And there we go. It's finished. And this is the result. We have an ID for the report. We have the name. We have a web URL that we could access directly to pull that report directly. We have an embed URL that can be used for Power BI embedding to embed that report. You'll notice that the data set is blank. I don't know why it does this, but it does. When it first creates a report, even though it creates a data set, it returns blank. But if you were to pull this through a get report call again with the ID of the report that you just got back, you will get the data set ID. You'll see what the data set is. All right, so now what do we expect? We expect to see a new report with a data set called real-time demo, and those little lines up there indicating exclamation that, hey, we've got new content inside of our workspace. So let's go ahead and look at that report, which just has one row of data in it at the moment. Again, this was going to be used for the demo. I was going to have all of you hit a URL and plot everyone's location on a map. So that's coming. I'm going to get it working one way or another. But nonetheless, you can see that we've gone ahead and we've imported a report, right? So it's a little bit more involved to do a demo of the following scenario, but I want to give a scenario of you can import a report into from, say, dev to production. But keep in mind that when you import a PBIX, if you're referencing a data source that's in dev, let's say that your data set is referencing a SQL Server data source, right? Or an analysis services data source. That data source reference inside your PBIX, when you upload the PBIX, is still referencing your dev SQL Server, which doesn't work, right? We don't want that in production. What you can do after you've imported a report with a PBIX with its respective data set, which points back to your dev, points back to your dev SQL Server or data source, you can actually remap or rebind, is what it's called, the data source. So you can pass in a new connection string for your data source for production and rebind your data source for that new report that you uploaded into production. And that we did that pretty extensively at the project that I was referring to. So in that particular example, I believe there's I don't know if there's a way to do that with Power BI. I know you can do it with the raw, with PowerShell. I know you can do it with the raw, with the low-level API here. Let's go ahead and I'll show that to you. I think it's under data sets. There's an actual rebind call. Why am I not finding it? Bind to gateway, that's not it. This particular example would basically have you specify an actual different data source, like you'd actually create the data source and rebind it, but I could have, oh, you know what, it's under reports, forgive me. Because what happens is rebind report, there it is. It's confusing, you're actually rebinding, you're rebinding it to a different data set. So what you can do, there's two things that can happen. And I just want everyone to be aware of this because this is actually kind of important. You import a report. When you first import a PBIX, it will always create a data set unless that data set already exists. So if you're importing a report into Power BI, right, and there's a reference to that data set inside of your dev workspace, for example, the report is still pointing to the data set in that workspace, unless you intentionally have it create a new data set inside of your production environment, which you can do. You still have to rebind the dev report to the new data set, which happens to reference your production data source. So it's a little bit multiple steps. It's beyond an intro. I just wanted everyone to be aware that that capability is out there. I'll go ahead and see if I can add that as an extra demo before I finish all the samples. But there's that. Any questions that I can take at this point? Any additional questions?
I don't see questions. I see a lot of thank yous and great presentation. I'm not sure if anyone has any final questions. Wilson?
Can you access SharePoint or SharePoint list through the API?
No, this is purely for Power BI, but there are APIs for SharePoint.
Okay. But a SharePoint list, can you access it?
Inside of here, I'm not familiar with the SharePoint list. Is that something that you can put into Power BI?
Yeah, it's like a source. Like a.
Oh, it's a source type?
Yeah.
Presume if you, I mean, you can access all data sources. So if there is a data source that's, you know, of type SharePoint list, I guess you can go ahead and actually access it through here. Let me see what the, because there's data source types. It won't tell me what those are, but if it was a, if the data source type was a SharePoint list, you can get information on it here. But I'm not sure what exactly you would be getting outside of the data source connection details, which might have some references to the SharePoint.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You're not going to
Maybe
go. You're not going to go pull the data from it necessarily. Like that's not what the API is for. This API is for administering, you know, Power BI mostly. But you did mention, and the other individual did mention exporting data from a report, and we did talk about that. That's why I have no problem. I'd be more than happy to try to do that right now, to try to export a report to PDF, and then also you mentioned a CSV. So if you and the other individual would love to stay around, I'd be more than happy to keep this going. I just don't want to keep everyone else. So if anyone has any other questions, please do ask now. I'd be more than happy to answer them before we decide to go off the path. Yep. So let me put up my last screen here one more time. Again, I'll have the resources posted by tomorrow at that URL right there, PBI API under liktorius.com/go, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Feel free to contact me through those different means of contact.
All right. Thank you so much, Darius.
You're welcome.
This was amazing. And thank you
Yeah,
everyone
good
for
job.
being here.